There was something wrong with the way she held the glass. It wasn't clumsiness the cobalt blue evening gown shimmered beneath the baccarat crystal chandeliers with the precision of a cut jewel. And her posture was flawless, her dark blonde bun without a single hair out of place. Her shoulders squared with the exactness of someone who practiced posture not as a social habit, but as a functional protocol. It was something else. It was the way her fingers wrapped around the crystal stem. Not with the distracted lightness of someone holding champagne at a party, but with the hyper-focused attention of someone gripping an unfamiliar object, actively monitoring her own physical pressure to ensure she didn't squeeze too hard or let go too soon. All around her, a Strauss waltz filled the ballroom with the sweeping generosity of music written for massive spaces and even grander occasions. Hundreds of guests in haute couture gowns and custom tuxedos circulated with the liquid grace of people who grew up learning exactly how to move in this kind of ecosystem: the calculated handshakes, the perfectly volume-controlled laughter, the dark art of being present without ever being too available. She stood dead still in the front row of the dance floor, like a figure painted into a tableau that was never designed to include her. And then the ballroom doors blew open. The deafening crash came before a single word was shouted, the violent impact of the solid oak double doors smashing against the drywall. The thundering sound of rapid, tactical boots charging across the marble. And then the booming voice that sliced the waltz dead in the middle of a measure with the absolute authority of someone who does not ask for permission to interrupt. FBI, nobody move. Up on the stage, a man standing with his glass raised for a toast that would never happen froze completely solid. Not out of submission to the command, but possessed by the specific, terrifying paralysis that hits when the human body processes a catastrophic reality the mind violently refuses to accept. The expensive spray tan on his face began to drain away, fading slowly like watercolors bleeding into a wet canvas. The arrogant smile had flash-frozen on his face, taking on the grotesque, plastic quality of expressions that linger long after the emotion that built them has died. His panicked eyes swept the ballroom. They found her. She didn't have an ounce of hatred on her face. She wore the serene, chilling expression of someone verifying a solved equation, the quiet confirmation of math that had been calculated flawlessly. The data she had whispered to herself earlier that night. Low and completely devoid of inflection. Like someone reading a bank statement out loud just to verify the digits. The liquid assets had been violently siphoned through a non-standardized asset-backed security fund. The offshore SWIFT code ended in XG77. The encrypted thumb drive was safely tucked inside her bra. She had meticulously accounted for every single bleeding cent. But to understand how a mailroom clerk ended up standing in that ballroom, wearing that gown and holding that drive, we need to go back underground. We need to descend to where there are absolutely no windows, where the cheap neon flickers, and where the billionaire world above only exists as a muffled echo bleeding down the elevator shaft. The mailroom of Meridian Bank was buried in the sub-basement of the main corporate tower, not the parking garage basement. But the deep functional sub-basement, that depressing concrete level that exists in every massive corporate skyscraper, a place nobody ever visits intentionally, but where a massive chunk of the actual grueling labor happens. The fluorescent lighting had been installed during a cheap renovation 15 years ago, and one specific bulb had been faintly flickering for 7. A flicker so agonizingly constant that everyone down there had eventually become blind to it except for her. She had formally requested a bulb replacement via email 3 separate times, receiving 2 automated delivery receipts and 0 actual maintenance. The air smelled of decaying paper, violently mixed with hot printer toner and the dry, suffocating stale breath of a room with 0 natural circulation. There were massive towers of envelopes, rubber stamps lined up by exact millimeter size on a rubber mat, industrial franking machines that produced a highly specific, grating, mechanical whine not deafening by the chaotic standards of the outside world, but broadcasting on a frequency that drilled into the eardrum with a psychotic persistence. That compounded hour after agonizing hour. There was a cheap cardboard box of neon orange foam earplugs sitting right next to the paperclip drawer. Because she had learned, over brutal years of trial and error, that this was the absolute only way to make the job survivable. Her name was Iris Foster, and she was somewhere between 28 and 32 years old. Depending entirely on which aspect of her face you were analyzing, her features held a soft youthfulness that her eyes brutally contradicted. Not out of trauma or sadness, but due to the hyperfocused, consuming quality of attention that exists in the eyes of people who process their environment vastly differently than the herd, and therefore register 10 times more than the rest of the world ever. Her pale skin rarely saw direct sunlight. The daily circuit was apartment, subway, subbasement, subway, apartment, a rigid routine with variations that never factored in a casual walk in the sun. Her dark blonde hair was locked into a bun with the ruthless precision of a woman who leaves zero margin for random variables, every single bobby pin inserted at the exact optimal angle. The tension perfectly calibrated to hold the hair secure without pulling too tight, because pulling too tight generated a diffuse sensory nightmare that compounded until it became physically paralyzing. The grey polyester uniform was baggy by design. She had submitted a formal request to corporate HR, writing an email with 3 dense paragraphs of clinical justification, asking to swap the synthetic fabric for pure cotton or any natural fiber. She clearly explained that prolonged dermal contact with polyester generated a sensory overload that severely compromised her concentration. HR had responded with a generic automated link to the company's mental wellness portal. She had found the neon orange foam earplugs at a local hardware store. They cost $3.80 a pair. The towering stacks of documents on Iris's desk were geometrically flawless. Not because management had trained her to do it, but because there was a profound, functional peace found in rigid order that other chaotic forms of organization simply failed to provide. Plus, perfectly aligned documents were vastly more efficient to retrieve on demand, which was the practical, logical reason she offered whenever anyone asked about the stacks. But questions rarely happened, because nobody ever stepped foot in the subbasement without a very specific, usually miserable, reason. She worked entirely alone. There were technically 2 other low-level clerks assigned to the mailroom on the bank's official corporate roster, but one had aggressively begged for a transfer after 3 weeks, and the other had developed a miraculous system of ghosting his shifts. Management tacitly ignored the truancy because the Daily Mail continued to be processed with terrifying, flawless punctuality, and absolutely no one in a tailored suit cared enough to ask who was actually doing all the heavy lifting. "IT was here." It was always her. She rocked her torso slightly while she worked forward, backward, locking into the droning rhythm of the franking machines. It was a physical stim she had eventually learned to accept as a vital part of her operating system rather than a glitch to be suppressed. Though she had wasted years of her life violently trying to force herself to sit still before reaching that conclusion, the rocking regulated the noise. The precise, repetitive labor regulated the chaos. The geometric stacks regulated her mind. What aggressively did not regulate her mind was the sound of the heavy metal mailroom door suddenly violently swinging open. The 3 executive assistants from the C-suite were all between 25 and 28, sharing that toxic, specific brand of confidence wielded by attractive people who figured out early on that implicit, brutal hierarchies run corporate environments, and actively chose to position themselves on the throat-stepping side of the ladder. They occasionally descended to the sub-basement, never for actual work, but for that sick, unspoken social sport that exists in every toxic office. The kind of psychological bullying that flirts heavily with HR violations without ever crossing the concrete line that makes it actionable. They knew about the Asperger's. Not officially, Iris had never disclosed her autism diagnosis on a single HR intake form, because she had learned the hard way long before stepping foot in Meridian Bank that certain medical data creates certain toxic perceptions which instantly kills certain careers before they even start. But there was something in Iris's rigid behavior that was glaringly obvious to people who pay attention for all the wrong, cruel reasons. And those three assistants had definitely paid attention for the wrong reasons. The main franking machine had an analog volume dial that Iris meticulously kept parked at level 2 loud enough to monitor the operational feed, but well within the tolerable threshold when wearing the orange earplugs. When one of the smirking assistants casually walked by and cranked the dial to maximum, the mechanical scream that erupted wasn't just louder. It was a piercing, violent frequency that violently stabbed through the orange foam in a way level 2 never did. The physical impact on Iris's shoulders was instantaneous and devastating. A rigid, brutal tension shot straight up her spine and locked her neck before her brain could even process the sabotage. She violently flinched, curling inward. The three women giggled, emitting that cruel, specific sound of bullies who just got exactly the pathetic reaction they paid for. And then the banker appeared in the doorway. Clayton Montgomery Vance was 56 years old, and had spent the last 30 of those years meticulously constructing the godlike persona he now effortlessly inhabited. He wore it with the terrifying ease of a man who has practiced his own myth for so long that the performance and the actual human being have become utterly indistinguishable. His expensive spray tan was religiously maintained at a high-end medical spa. His blinding smile had been surgically calibrated over decades to simultaneously project charm, absolute dominance, and the subtle, arrogant suggestion that he was doing you a massive favor just by allowing you to exist in his presence. He looked at the scene, at his three smirking assistants, at the screaming industrial machine, at Iris hunched over with her shoulders locked, wearing neon orange earplugs, and he laughed. Not the polite, awkward laugh that diffuses a miserable situation, the dark, booming laugh that endorses it. The laugh that silently screams that destroying someone weaker than you is perfectly acceptable in this ecosystem. He reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke cashmere blazer and pulled out a heavy, silver-embossed envelope. "Sweetheart," his voice dripped with the sickening, syrupy condescension of a predator having a good time. "What is your name again?" "Ah, who cares?" He shoved the silver envelope toward her with the arrogant flick of a king tossing table scraps to a peasant who should be weeping with gratitude. "You are formally invited to the bank's winter gala. It's a high-profile charity event. We are writing a massive tax write-off to an institution for a highly calculated, mocking pause, special needs people. We want you there as our honorary mascot for corporate social inclusion. Wear your absolute best evening gown." "Oh, wait." His blinding smile stretched wider, showing teeth. "You only own that pathetic, baggy prison jumpsuit, don't you?" The three assistants erupted into cackles. It was glaringly obvious they had been anticipating this exact punchline. That the billionaire CEO had intentionally walked all the way down to the sub-basement just to deliver this humiliating execution with an audience. "She's gonna be spinning in circles on the dance floor like a defective Roomba." One of them gasped, bending over in performative hysterics. "It's gonna be the absolute freak show of the year." Iris had not lifted her eyes from her stack of perfectly aligned documents for a single second during the entire slaughter. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the dead, mechanical quality of an automated text reader, not deliberately freezing them out, but exhibiting the natural, autistic absence of emotional inflection of a brain processing raw verbal data without the social filter that masks pain with tone. Winter Gala, 1900 hours, the Grand Ballroom. "Formal black théâtre?" Acknowledged. Her robotic response was instantly treated as part of the comedy routine by the four of them. Just one more pathetic glitch to add to their repertoire of weird Iris stories that made her such a convenient punching bag. They walked out, laughing up the concrete stairwell, leaving the heavy silver envelope tossed carelessly onto a stack of freshly franked mail, sitting at a geometrical angle that violently clashed with the rest of the pile. She meticulously reached out and realigned the envelope. Then she slowly shifted her eyes to the yellow legal pad sitting next to the stack of registered mail. The pad had absolutely zero doodles. It never had doodles. Iris didn't doodle, not out of strict discipline, but because her brain did not generate chaotic scribbles. It generated pure structural architecture. What filled that legal pad were endless microscopic columns of numbers written in flawless, machine-like print over the last 18 months. The mailroom shared a concrete wall directly adjacent to the main elevator shaft that shot straight up to the executive C-suite. It was a bizarre architectural flaw she had mapped out during her first week on the job, not because she was snooping, but because her auditory processing picked up frequencies vastly differently than normal people. She had quickly realized that specific, high-level conversations taking place on the 14th floor echoed straight down the concrete shaft with terrifying, crystal clear acoustics during the quietest hours of the shift. She had started writing down what she heard. Not because she had some grand, cinematic plan to use the intel initially. It was simply what her hyperanalytical brain automatically did with numerical patterns it repeatedly heard. It recorded them. It organized them, and it aggressively hunted for the underlying mathematical structure. Routing, account numbers, offshore hedge fund titles, wire transfer timestamps, massive 8-figure sums casually tossed around in phone calls executed with the blind, arrogant confidence of men who never, ever imagine that the sub-basement is listening. Over the span of 18 months, the columns had grown. Over the span of 18 months, the pattern had crystallized into something terrifying. She didn't understand social irony. She didn't naturally recognize when a corporate invitation was weaponized to humiliate her. She processed the invitation purely as logistical data, and the logistical data on the silver card dictated winter gala. 7 p.m., the grand ballroom, formal black tie attire. But she understood forensic accounting mathematics with an apocalyptic depth that the 18 months of tiny numbers on the yellow pad had only sharpened into a lethal weapon. And she had calculated, with the bulletproof precision of a massive equation verified 36 times, that the numbers she had pulled out of the elevator shaft amounted to roughly $340 million. $340 million violently siphoned from blind investors over for years, laundered through a non-standardized asset-backed security fund, pumped straight into ghost accounts whose offshore SWIFT codes she had meticulously reconstructed from fragmented echoes. She built the case with the agonizing patience of a genius assembling a massive jigsaw puzzle that the rest of the world couldn't even see because they didn't know the pieces existed. The encrypted thumb drive had been purchased at a local pharmacy for $12. The stunning, cobalt blue evening gown had been hunted down at a high-end vintage consignment shop. She had spent 45 minutes in the store, meticulously running her index finger over dozens of fabrics to assess their sensory texture, searching for the exact molecular weave that would survive hours of wear without triggering the kind of agonizing sensory overload that would utterly destroy the absolute hyperfocus she needed for tonight. It had cost her $85. It shimmered under artificial light with the flawless physical physics of a garment that had been engineered for exactly this moment. It's hard to believe a billionaire would spend years taking the elevator down to the basement just to use an autistic clerk as a punching bag for his own ego, isn't it? If you are violently disgusted by this kind of cruelty, smash that like button right now to prove you stand with Iris. That night, while the Strauss waltz flooded the grand ballroom with 700 years of European elegance, Iris had arrived at exactly 7 o'clock p.m. on the dot because 7 p.m. meant 7 p.m., not 7:10. Not 7:05, exactly 19 o'clock hours. She walked in, wearing the cobalt blue gown, her bun without a single stray hair, and the thumb drive shoved deep into the absolute only place on her body she had calculated as 100% secure for transport. She had anchored herself in the front row of the dance floor, gripping the champagne flute like a hostile foreign object, aggressively monitoring the physical pressure of her fingertips. She was waiting for the exact moment she knew was coming, because she had mathematically calculated the probability based on the target's behavioral data. concluding there was a 93% chance he would make his move within a 45-minute window after the opening remarks. Up on the stage, Clayton Montgomery Vance had raised his glass, and then the doors had blown open. The boutique was located at a high-end address that was in itself an aggressive statement of intent. There was absolutely no street number plastered on the facade, just the designer's name etched in gold leaf across frosted glass. Because luxury ecosystems operate on the arrogant assumption that if you belong there, you already know where it is and you don't need numerical directions to find it. The heavy door was made of tempered glass with a solid bronze handle. And there was a highly discreet security guard stationed inside who never stood perfectly still, but was always standing exactly where he tactically needed to be. Iris had arrived on foot, wearing her baggy grey polyester uniform completely swallowed by a heavy wool coat she wore year-round. Because the temperature differential between the bank's sub-basement and the outside grid was exactly 12 degrees. And the heavy coat was the most efficient thermodynamic solution to the transition. She had stopped on the sidewalk for a moment, not paralyzed by social anxiety, but executing a rapid logistical assessment. The dress was right there in the window. She had seen the high-res photo on the website during her initial intel gathering, verified the fabric specs, and confirmed that the sapphire-threaded embroidery crafted by the French atelier was stitched over a pure silk base. Silk was the exact fiber her tactile experiments at the vintage shop had identified as totally sensory compatible. Long before she knew what dress she was hunting for, she walked in. The two saleswomen were gossiping in the back of the store with the relaxed posture of retail workers who don't expect a viable commission at that hour. The highly specific, suffocating silence that crashed down the second they saw Iris walk through the door was the silence of a toxic ecosystem that runs on unwritten wealth criteria, rapidly evaluating an intruder in real time. The battered wool coat, the ugly grey uniform peeking out at the collar, the black Velcro orthopedic shoes. One of the saleswomen glided forward, wearing that razor-sharp, professional smile that aggressively hides the unspoken question of whether you have any earthly idea what store you just wandered into. Iris didn't look her in the eye. She just pointed a rigid finger at the front window. That one. The saleswoman tracked the finger. The cobalt blue evening gown, heavily embroidered with sapphire threads, draped over a mannequin lit by a harsh directional spotlight, the exact kind of apocalyptic luxury piece the boutique kept in the window, not because they expected to sell it to a walk-in, but as a violent declaration of exactly what they were capable of sourcing. That specific gown is valued at $2 million. The saleswoman's voice carried the sickening, gentle condescension of someone trying to kill a conversation before it gets embarrassing for both parties. Perhaps you would prefer I show you some of our clearance options. That Iris slapped a plastic card onto the glass counter, not with dramatic flair. Visidet. Functional gesture of someone executing a transaction she had mapped out in her head long before she touched the door handle. It was an international debit card issued by a shadow financial institution that only mailed that specific piece of black plastic to clients holding a highly classified volume of liquid assets under management. The saleswoman stared at the card. Then she stared at Iris. Then she shot a panicked, silent look to the other saleswoman. Using that telepathic communication that people who work retail develop to signal a crisis, the card reader was slowly brought over. Iris punched in her PIN with the exact same robotic fingers that had franked hundreds of thousands of envelopes with identical, flawless precision. Approved. The money had bled into that offshore account over a grueling 5-year process that had started as a simple mathematical exercise and violently mutated into something astronomical. There was a massive corporate tax return loophole that the bank systematically hid from its low-level employees, a malicious fiscal sub-optimization that Iris had instantly spotted while processing highly classified tax documents passing through the mailroom. She had initially just patched the loophole on her own personal tax returns because the math violently dictated that it was the correct formula. Then she took the recovered funds and aggressively funneled them into high-risk, offshore hedge funds whose complex algorithms she had dissected using the exact same methodology she applied to the yellow legal pad. She had mathematically forecasted the shadow funds with a terrifying precision that no Wall Street quant had ever been paid to produce. Over 5 years, the compounding interest had detonated. The stunned saleswoman wrapped the $2 million gown in acid-free tissue paper, placing it inside a heavy cardboard box stamped with a gold logo, moving with the rigid, ritualistic panic of someone trained to make a luxury purchase feel like a religious experience. Iris waited, her eyes locked blankly on the street outside the window, not looking at anything in particular, just wearing the dead expression of someone waiting for a slow computer to finish rendering a file. She walked out with the box and took the subway back to her apartment. On the night of the gala, she had arrived at exactly 19 o'clock hours on the dot. The grand ballroom at the Imperiale Hotel had been rented for a staggering sum that Iris had instantly calculated. The second she read the venue name, on the silver invitation she had memorized the elite corporate rental rates for the entire city. Because event contracts constantly bled through the mailroom and her brain hoarded the data by pure habit. The ballroom technically held 700 guests, and there were maybe 500 bodies inside, mathematically proving that the bank had intentionally booked a grossly oversized venue just to aggressively communicate excessive wealth. So massive baccarat crystal chandeliers hanging over the dance floor produced a complex light refraction that Iris had logged the second she walked in. There was a strict geometric pattern in how the light bounced off the marble, perfectly mimicking the hexagonal grid of the crystal arrays. She spent a solid minute mentally calculating the angle of refraction before violently redirecting her focus to the tactical position she had planned to occupy. Front row of the dance floor. Direct, unobstructed line of sight to the main stage. The dress had flawlessly passed the tactile test. The pure silk base was exactly what she had mathematically predicted would be tolerable, and the heavy sapphire embroidery added a perfectly distributed weight that didn't trigger the agonizing, asymmetrical sensory spikes that cheap, uneven fabrics caused. She had spent the first 20 minutes of the night calibrating her nervous system, allowing her body to boot up and adjust to the alien texture, the heavy weight, and the highly specific physics of how the gown moved with every step. The elite guests buzzing around her had instinctively generated that invisible, toxic force field that high society crowds naturally project around people who don't belong, not a deliberate, hostile exclusion, just the organic, magnetic repulsion of a body that completely refused to participate in the fake, performative dance of networking these events demanded. She had blatantly ignored too condescending remarks thrown in her direction because she had instantly categorized them as rhetorical insults, the kind of bait that doesn't actually require a factual answer. She heard the cruel whispers. The bank's pet robot, the freak from the basement. She logged the audio data with the absolute zero emotion of a machine cataloging irrelevant background noise that didn't factor into the primary algorithm. The orchestra had flawlessly executed for waltzers by the time Clayton Montgomery Vance stepped up to the microphone with the arrogant ease of a man who believed the world was his stage, or had at least brainwashed himself with enough practice that the delusion was rock solid. An assistant, hovering nearby with the desperate attention of someone paid to anticipate God's needs, rapidly adjusted the mic stand to his exact height. He stared out at the sea of billionaires with the blinding smile he had spent 3 decades sharpening into a weapon. "Before we raise our glasses for tonight's toast," he had purred into the mic, his voice dripping with the fake generosity of a king handing out bread, "I want to introduce you all to someone incredibly special." His predatory eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto Iris in the front row. "Our beloved," a vile, theatrical smirk, "our little paper-sorting clerk. Come on up to the stage, sweetheart." There was a brutal, unspoken social protocol in these toxic environments. Iris had read a dense organizational psychology paper detailing corporate power dynamics. When an apex predator with absolute hierarchical authority publicly summons a vulnerable subordinate to a stage. Refusing the command triggers catastrophic, long-term professional retaliation. She ran the probability matrix in her head and stepped onto the stage. The glare of the directional spotlights was vastly more aggressive than she had estimated. An immediate sensory adjustment was required. She tilted her chin down, deliberately limiting her optical input until her visual cortex adapted to the blinding lumens. Ladies and gentlemen, Clayton's voice boomed through the ballroom, drowning them in his toxic charisma. This woman, right here, is living proof of our bank's commitment to total inclusion. Just look at how stunningly out of place she is. A highly calculated pause, waiting for the cruel laughter he knew he had bought. It rippled through the crowd. By the way, sweetheart, do you even know how to waltz? Or does that defective brain of yours only process barcodes and rubber stamps? The sea of billionaires erupted into that specific, hideous roar of laughter that only happens when an authority figure explicitly grants the mob permission to be evil. Not spontaneous joy, but the sick, relieved laughter of cowards who are just glad the predator isn't looking at them. The glowing screens of hundreds of smartphones instantly shot up into the air. She rapidly logged the data pattern. Roughly 70% of the visible devices in the quadrant had been weaponized and pointed directly at the stage, recording. Iris stared dead at the floor. Her hands were locked rigid at her sides, her fingers slightly curled, not balling into fists out of rage, but executing a desperate sensory regulation tactic. Her torso began the subtle, almost invisible rocking motion that wasn't panic or weakness, but the emergency failsafe her nervous system had engineered to maintain structural integrity when the external data input catastrophically exceeded safe parameters. I do not dance. Her voice blasted through the microphone with her standard robotic delivery, informative, flat, completely lacking the trembling humiliation that the psychological torture would have ripped out of a normal human being. I calculate. Clayton looked out at the audience, his face beaming with the psychotic glee of a bully who had just been handed a loaded gun. You calculate? He mocked into the mic, dragging the syllables out so the billionaires could savor the cruelty. Are you calculating exactly how many laughs you're giving us tonight? He mockingly mimicked her autistic, rocking motion with a grotesque, exaggerated sway of his shoulders. And the ballroom exploded with a tidal wave of vicious laughter, so deafening it physically drowned out the orchestra that was softly playing in the background. You can't put a price tag on this kind of entertainment. More roaring laughter. More glowing cameras raised high. They mocked her for being broken. Little did they know, her broken brain was the absolute only one in the room capable of reading the encrypted math that was about to vaporize their entire lives. If you absolutely despise people who humiliate the vulnerable for sport, hit that like button right now to prove you are riding with Iris. Iris stood dead still on the stage for exactly 4 additional seconds, satisfying the required protocol for an orderly tactical retreat. She had read a behavioral study proving that fleeing a stage immediately after a public humiliation broadcasts a narrative of weak, shameful defeat, whereas a calculated, unblinking pause before exiting projects terrifying composure. She walked down the 3 carpeted stairs with the exact same rigid, robotic posture she had used to walk up. She marched straight back to her exact coordinates in the front row of the dance floor. She recalibrated the physical pressure of her fingers gripping the champagne flute, and she locked herself into the exact tactical position she had mapped out, a direct, unobstructed line of sight to the stage, ensuring she was completely visible to the main event camera, and perfectly aligned with the grand ballroom doors. The exact doors she knew. We saw 93% mathematical certainty based on her intercepted data. The federal agents were about to breach. The encrypted thumb drive was burning against her chest inside her bra. The math was flawless. She waited. The toast never happened. The crystal baccarat flute was raised high in the air, the microscopic bubbles of the moat and Chandin racing upward in a perfect, single-file line dictated by the precise physics of pressurized carbon dioxide. Clayton Montgomery Vance's arm was locked in the arrogant pose he had literally practiced in his dressing room mirror. Because he had learned decades ago that spontaneous public dominance requires aggressive rehearsal when the sound hit. It wasn't the explosive crash of the doors first. It was the terrifying, apocalyptic vacuum of silence right before it. There is a microscopic fraction of a second that precedes a catastrophic radar split second where the atmospheric pressure in the room violently drops, and the human brain registers that reality is about to violently shatter before the eyes even see it happen. The orchestra had just finished a musical phrase, leaving a tiny, breathless rest in the sheet music before the next chord. And in that exact fraction of silence, the main doors to the grand ballroom blew open. They didn't just open, they were violently breached. The heavy oak doors smashed into the drywall with a thunderous crack that aggressively violated the room's carefully engineered acoustics. It was the brutal, deafening sound of a lethal force that didn't ask for an invitation, and therefore didn't give a damn about breaking the hinges on the way in. The armed tactical agents flooded the room in a geometric sweep that Iris instantly identified as a textbook perimeter containment protocol. She had memorized the exact FBI tactical raid manual 2 years ago when a classified copy accidentally bled through the mailroom destined for the bank's legal department, and her brain had swallowed the blueprint whole. The special agent in charge leading the raid was a man in his early 40s, radiating the heavy, lethal posture of a man who earned his badge through blood and competence, not political theater. This made him vastly harder to read than the bloated, performative authorities Iris had studied in true crime documentaries. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice didn't need a microphone, it was a weaponized bark, perfectly calibrated by a man who had spent a decade commanding chaotic rooms without needing an amp. This is a Federal Bureau of Investigation raid executing a warrant for money laundering, aggravated tax evasion, and massive wire fraud. Absolutely no one leaves this room without showing federal ID. The orchestra died. Not a clean stop. The first violinist froze mid-bow, producing a screech, and the rest of the string section collapsed in a chaotic, uncoordinated mess of musicians whose brains had just been violently rebooted by trauma, and needed a full second to process that the concert was over. The silence that instantly crushed the room was the terrifying, collective silence of 500 billionaires simultaneously processing a nightmare that absolutely none of their expensive risk assessment models had predicted for tonight. And then, the silence shattered. What erupted wasn't a cinematic panic. Nobody was screaming, nobody was trampling each other to reach the fire exits. It was the deeply specific, cold-blooded panic of ultra-rich psychopaths who have entirely too much to lose, and who have been trained by their wealth to instantly switch into a ruthless survival calculus under extreme stress. A guy in a navy blue tuxedo rapidly unclasped a massive gold watch from his wrist, frantically scanning the room with the crazed eyes of a man desperately hunting for a trash can discreet enough to hide a bribe. A woman in a gold sequin gown violently snapped open her designer clutch, staring down into the silk lining, her eyes doing the terrifying math of what contraband she could explain away to a federal judge and what would get her 20 years. Dozens of smartphones were yanked out of pockets not to film for TikTok, but to desperately dial offshore lawyers, triggering the exact horrifying moment when 50 different billionaires simultaneously realized they had 0 bars of service. The FBI cell site simulator was currently nooking the entire commercial communication spectrum inside the hotel. Iris had read about the Stingray jammer in that exact same tactical manual. She had mathematically guaranteed it would be deployed. Clayton Montgomery Vance had lowered his glass. It happened in agonizing slow motion, not cinematic slow motion, but the terrifying neurological slowdown the human brain forces when it hyperfocuses on a catastrophic threat. Iris had been hyperfocused on that exact coordinate of the stage since she arrived. His arm dropped. The crystal flute clipped the edge of the podium with a sharp clink that was completely swallowed by the rising chaos of the room, but Iris visually logged the violent tremor shaking the glass. And then the banker moved, not forward, not stepping up to the microphone to project dominance and demand a warrant like an innocent man. He broke sideways, sliding aggressively toward the right wing of the stage, slipping behind the heavy velvet curtain that masked the service corridor leading to the industrial kitchens. It was a desperate move disguised as a discreet exit, but discreet requires the room to be looking the other way. And there were four federal agents whose absolute only job tonight was to track the physical coordinates of Clayton Montgomery Vance. He hit the service corridor. He sprinted through the stainless steel industrial kitchen with the panicked, hyperventilating urgency of a rat navigating a maze he had only ever mapped out in his head but never actually practiced blowing past. Terrified line cooks frozen exactly where they stood when the raid alarm dropped. He hit the walk-in freezer, banked hard left, and violently slammed his body into the crash bar of the emergency exit bleeding out into the hotel's back alley. The two federal agents standing in the freezing rain had been waiting. They hadn't tried to block his route from the inside. They deliberately let him run. They let him hit the door, let him feel the crash bar give way. Let the freezing winter rain hit his face and let his brain experience one agonizing fraction of a second of sweet, delusional freedom right before he slammed face first into two tactical vests, two drawn Glock 19s, and the immovable brick wall of agents who weren't standing there by accident, but because they had been handed a flawless architectural blueprint. You have absolutely no idea who the hell you are dealing with. His voice was totally stripped of the booming microphone. And, with it, stripped of the godlike authority that usually kept him alive. It cracked, exposing the pathetic, weak whine of a bully who suddenly realizes that without his billions he is nothing. I built this damn economy. This is an absolute outrage. Neither agent said a word. They slammed him against the brick wall. They ratcheted the steel cuffs tight. Back inside the ballroom, while the tactical team swept the floor with clipboards aggressively logging IDs, and the few guests who actually memorized their lawyers' phone numbers desperately fought over the hotel's landlines, which the Stingray jammer couldn't block. One single figure was moving completely differently than the screaming herd. She wasn't running. She wasn't paralyzed. She was simply walking. There was something in the exact physics of how Iris crossed the ballroom that violently clashed with the chaos around her. Not because she was moving too fast, but because her trajectory was a flawless, geometric straight line cutting through the erratic, terrified, emotional panic of everyone else. She glided past screaming billionaires with the eerie, robotic anticipation of an AI calculating collision vectors a split second before the impact happens. She never broke stride. She never hesitated. She simply executed the exact pre-calculated route through the grid. The special agent in charge was anchored next to a massive, 5-tier fake decorative cake that had been ordered purely as a ridiculous prop for the gala, currently surrounded by forensic agents aggressively triaging seized cell phones. He had successfully orchestrated the breach, locked down the perimeter, and just received the crisp radio confirmation in his earpiece that the primary target was in cuffs in the back alley. He was aggressively flipping through a seized ledger when the woman in the cobalt blue gown, covered in sapphire threads, stopped exactly 4.5 feet from his position. "Ma'am," his tone was a lethal, automated warning, the cold bark of a tactical commander dealing with an unmapped variable approaching his perimeter. "Back away immediately. We are in the middle of an active federal raid." Iris did not blink. She did not break eye contact. Her right hand moved smoothly to the plunging neckline of her gown, slipping into the negative space between the silk and her skin. The absolute only quadrant of her body she had mathematically proven would bypass any security wand at the front door. Because the dress lacked underwire and she hadn't tripped the metal detectors when she flashed her silver VIP ticket. The thumb drive was tiny, cheap, black plastic, the exact $12 garbage brand she had bought at the corner pharmacy. The cardboard packaging was currently sitting in her recycling bin back home. cleanly sliced open by the dull scissors she kept in the second compartment of her left-hand desk drawer in the mailroom. She held it out. This contains the fully unredacted, decrypted accounting matrix. Her voice carried the dead, robotic cadence of a supercomputer printing out a receipt. There was zero panic, because all of her panic had been violently burned off over 18 months of grinding in the dark. Auxiliary ledger B18. Synthetic current asset accounts X3 bridging to ghost liabilities. Y9. Every single highly classified financial term left her lips with the terrifying precision of a creator. She didn't just know the names of the files. She intimately knew the corrupt architectural DNA they were built with, because she was the one who had reverse-engineered the bomb to expose it. The shadow funds are triangulated through a private server in Liechtenstein, routing number 447G8832. The shell corporation is Orion Holdings. The ultimate beneficiary is the screaming man in the grey tuxedo your team just tackled trying to jump out the bathroom window. The special agent involuntarily snapped his head toward the men's restroom hallway. There was an agent standing guard right outside the door. The exact discrepancy of $2.8 billion has been fraudulently coded as artistic consulting acquisitions. She kept rapid-firing the data in the exact same flat, relentless rhythm, completely devoid of dramatic pauses. Because the math didn't require theatrical packaging to be a slaughter. This constitutes a catastrophic breach of the U.S. Federal Reserve, falling under Title 18, U.S. Code. Section 1344 for bank fraud. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines total 28 years in federal prison. The cheap plastic thumb drive hovered in her outstretched hand. The special agent stared at it. Then he stared at her, then back at the plastic drive. Then back at her face, and this time his brain finally registered the terrifying anomaly he had missed in his first tactical sweep. It was the quality of her eyes. They were deadlocked onto his, completely lacking the frantic, rapid-fire darting that normal humans exhibit under extreme adrenaline. She didn't blink at a normal human frequency. She radiated the terrifying, absolute zero-point focus of a woman who had spent 18 months writing microscopic numbers on a yellow legal pad in a basement, waiting for this exact fraction of a second to hand the bomb to the one man who could detonate it. He slowly reached out and took the drive. His hand was slightly shaking. "How the hell did you?" He choked on the sentence. Iris stared at the thumb drive resting in the federal agent's palm for a single second. Then she slowly turned her head to look at the empty stage, where Clayton Montgomery Vance's crystal flute was still teetering on the edge of the podium, the warm, abandoned champagne slowly losing its last few bubbles. "My desk sits directly against the concrete wall of the executive elevator shaft." The answer was delivered with the terrifying simplicity of a genius explaining basic math to a toddler. "The acoustics are flawed. The sound bleeds through. I listen. I transcribe. A 1-second, machine-like pause. I did that every single day for 18 months. There was a glaring, unspoken question written all over the agent's face, or variation of "Why the hell didn't you blow the whistle a year ago?" Iris had mathematically anticipated the question and had preloaded the answer in her head. Not because she enjoyed reading facial expressions, but because she had learned the hard way that neurotypical people communicate in unspoken code. And it was vastly more efficient to just crush the code before they spoke it. Internal compliance buried my anonymous report with a 4-line automated rejection email. She stated flatly, "Oh, I decided to wait for a competent level of authority to arrive." The special agent stared at the cheap thumb drive one last time before slipping it deep inside the breast pocket of his tactical Kevlar vest, moving with the terrifying, delicate care of a man handling a nuclear launch code. He opened his mouth to say something else, but the radio earpiece jammed into his ear squawked first the crisp, static-laced voice of a tactical unit confirming perimeter lockdown on the men's restroom, window secured, second co-conspirator officially in cuffs. Clayton Montgomery Vance had actually tried to squeeze out the bathroom window, the men's restroom window, at The Imperiale Hotel opened directly into the exact same rainy back alley as the kitchen's emergency exit. Iris had meticulously audited the building's architectural blueprints buried in a corporate lease renewal that had passed through the mailroom back in March. She knew there were two federal agents waiting in the alley. She had mathematically calculated the probability of a bathroom window escape attempt at exactly 71%. She had emailed the special agent in charge 48 hours before the raid using an encrypted Proton Mail account routed to the FBI Financial Crimes Division directory she scraped off the dark web. The email contained the hotel's floor plans, the 3 viable exit vectors, and the statistical probability of the targets using each specific door ranked in descending order. An FBI analyst had actually replied with a read receipt. The tactical teams had been waiting at all 3 exits. Now I'm asking you, if you were in Iris's shoes, after 18 agonizing months of eavesdropping through an elevator shaft, writing code in the dark, and getting publicly humiliated on a stage with a nuke shoved in your bra, would you have possessed the icy patience to wait for the perfect moment? Or would you have snapped? Drop your absolute honest truth in the comments. I need to know what you would do. Back in the ballroom, the 5-tier fake wedding cake was entirely untouched. The baccarat crystal chandeliers continued to shimmer with the cold, physical indifference of expensive glass that does not care about the lives being destroyed beneath it. The orchestra had packed away their cellos and violins with the traumatized, robotic movements of musicians waiting for the police to tell them they were allowed to go home. Iris had marched straight back to her coordinates in the front row of the dance floor. She had readjusted her finger pressure on the warm champagne flute, and she stood in dead silence, wearing the chilling expression of a supercomputer that had run the massive equation, checked the output, and verified that the math was flawless. This story proves that the brilliant mind the world ruthlessly ignores is usually the absolute only one, watching everything burn, and the autism that toxic bullies mock as a weakness is the exact same superpower that, in the freezing silence of a basement, builds a weapon so catastrophic that no billion-dollar defense lawyer can stop it. If you crave stories that rip your heart out and force you to look at the world differently, smash subscribe and ring the bell to join our family. Weaponized knowledge is the only currency the feds can't seize. See you in the next story. To truly grasp the apocalyptic weapon loaded onto that thumb drive, we need to crawl inside the mind that forged it. Not as a cute metaphor, literally. While the FBI forensic laptops were currently downloading the raw data off a $12 piece of plastic from a corner pharmacy, the true horror wasn't just in the financial ledgers. It was in the flawless, terrifying architecture of how the files had been assembled. The godlike precision that is only possible when the data mining software isn't code, it's a human brain. We need to rewind 18 months. Actually, further back than that. We need to go back to the exact second the very first envelope passed through Iris Foster's hands in the sub-basement mailroom of Meridian Bank. Her very first day on the job, when she showed up wearing the heavy wool coat, the orthopedics, and the neon orange foam earplugs. She was led into the windowless tomb by an arrogant floor manager who spent exactly 6 minutes barking instructions at her before sprinting back to the upper floors where the AC actually worked. Iris had stared blankly at the metal desk, at the chaotic mountains of mail, at the rubber stamps, at the screaming franking machines, and she went to work. What the arrogant floor manager didn't know, because nobody knew, because the disability inclusion nonprofit that placed her had only forwarded the heavily redacted medical files Iris explicitly authorized. Aggressively deleting her academic history was that every single piece of mail passing through her fingers wasn't just being physically sorted. It was being downloaded into a supercomputer. Eidetic memory is a highly volatile term that neurologists avoid using because pop culture has completely ruined the definition, but in Iris's specific brain chemistry, it meant that a 16-digit offshore routing number glimpsed on a passing invoice for a fraction of a second was permanently burned onto her hard drive. Should retrieve it 6 months later with flawless pixel-perfect accuracy, no degradation, no memory fog. It wasn't a struggle. It was just the terrifying, biological reality of what happened when she looked at numbers. And she looked at absolutely everything that passed through that mailroom. Not because she was a spy, but because it was her factory setting. Her brain lacked the natural filtering mechanism that normal humans use to ignore the crushing volume of useless data in the world. Every single number that entered her optic nerve was processed with max-level priority. Interbank wire transfers. Corporate routing codes. The names of shadowy shell corporations that statistically appeared way too often on invoices for generic consulting. Firms that completely lacked a digital footprint on the open web. The pattern recognition kicked in around month 3. It wasn't an explosive aha moment, it was a cold, mathematical observation. The exact same acronyms were bleeding across completely unrelated tax documents at a frequency that statistical variance could not logically explain. She started writing the data points down on the yellow legal pad. Not because she was playing detective, but because transcribing the data was the only way her brain could relieve the pressure of an incomplete algorithm. A year and a half later, the blueprint was flawless. And running in parallel, not as some master plan, but as the natural, inevitable consequence of holding the nuclear codes she started transmitting. She configured the encrypted deep web server on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Following a complex routing protocol she had pulled off a Russian cybersecurity forum she'd skimmed the week before. It wasn't Hollywood hacking, it was just weaponized. Anonymous onion routing using open source infrastructure that anyone with a 160 IQ could rig together. She had studied computational physics at MIT for grueling years before the doctoral program violently rejected her, not her brain. Never her brain, but the toxic, hypersocial gauntlet of department politics, networking mixers, and the unwritten demand that a genius with a 178 IQ must also perform the pathetic social tap dance that neurotypical academics require. She formally resigned from her PhD program via a 2-paragraph bullet-pointed email. She found the mailroom listing on a disability job board that Saturday morning. The parameters read: highly repetitive tasks, isolated environment, 0 requirement for interpersonal communication. She applied in 5 minutes. Meridian Bank hired her without having the slightest clue they were handing the keys to the kingdom to the most dangerous, lethal mathematical mind to walk through their doors in a century. They had absolutely no idea that the hyperspecific cocktail of eidetic memory, weaponized pattern recognition, and a structurally flawed, uninsulated elevator shaft was the only force on Earth capable of vaporizing the billion-dollar cartel they had built. Purely because they were arrogant enough to believe that the ghosts in the basement were blind. The anonymous informant codenamed Artemis dropped the very first fragmented data packet to the IRS exactly 6 months before the winter gala. It landed on the desk of a senior forensic auditor who spent 3 sleepless nights realizing that the encrypted fragment perfectly patched a massive, bleeding hole in an active federal probe they had been banging their heads against for years. The cartel's accounting encryption was so obscenely sophisticated that the government's standard AI threat models couldn't even see the walls, let alone the doors. Artemis saw the doors. She drip-fed them fragmented packets over 6 agonizing months, dropping each piece of the puzzle at the exact perfect millisecond, ensuring the feds digested the previous code before handing them the cipher to the next. It wasn't a massive data dump, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She was methodically spoon-feeding a treasure map to federal agents who had the guns to kick the doors down, but were too blind to find the house. The special agent in charge actually revealed this to Clayton Montgomery Vance while frog-marching him down the hotel corridor toward the exit, not trying to interrogate him, just aggressively twisting the knife. The kind of sadistic intel drop a cop feeds a billionaire when the cage is already locked tight, just to watch the ego shatter. The banker heard the name Artemis. He heard about the 6 months of encrypted emails. He heard that the entire weight of the IRS cyber division had spent 3 months desperately trying to unmask the whistleblower, only to crash into a dead-end deep web server that bounced their IP to nowhere. He slowly turned his head and stared at Iris, the woman he had brutally mocked in front of 500 billionaires, the pathetic paper sorter, the freak from the basement, the mascot for corporate inclusion whose defective brain only processed rubber stamps. There is a terrifying physical mutation that happens when a human being is forced to look at something they've been completely blind to for years. Violent cognitive recalibration, like a camera lens aggressively snapping into focus, suddenly rendering the blurry background as a razor-sharp, terrifying monster that was standing right behind you the whole time. You, the word fell out of his mouth, stripped of the microphone, stripped of his 30 years of media training, exposing the raw, pathetic whine of a broken man. You don't understand anything, and then, fueled by the blind panic of a rat trapped in a corner, you're a retard. How the hell did you do this? Iris slowly looked down at her champagne flute, not at him. C'est liquide. The microscopic bubbles had almost entirely died out, the gas bleeding into the atmosphere dictated by the relentless physics of depressurized liquids. The color had turned a sickly, darker yellow as the temperature climbed above the optimal chill. She stared at the dead liquid for a long moment with the cold. CLINICAL detachment of a scientist evaluating a failed chemical compound. Then, she looked up at him. For the absolute first time since she walked into that ballroom, she made direct, unblinking eye contact. Not the evasive, autistic side glance she usually deployed as a defense mechanism. It was a dead-center, terrifying lock. One pair of eyes burning with absolute zero-point focus, staring down another pair desperately searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. I do not understand jokes. Her voice was her standard. Robotic, baseline informative, flat, devoid of emotional modulation. But the sheer, cold-blooded emptiness of her tone in that specific second was infinitely more violent than a scream. I do not understand irony, but I understand numbers. And numbers do not lie, a flawless 1-second pause engineered to let the execution hang in the air. You lied. The numbers told the truth. It is a very simple equation. The federal agents violently shoved him forward. Clayton Montgomery Vance was dragged down the velvet hallway in steel cuffs. His expensive grey tuxedo, his spray tan, and his 30-year god complex reduced to nothing but a pathetic costume on a criminal being thrown out of his own party. While the baccarat chandeliers continued to shimmer indifferently above his head, Iris stayed exactly where she was. She stared down at the dead champagne one last time. She placed the untouched flute onto a passing tray with the robotic efficiency of someone discarding a tool that had successfully served its purpose and was no longer required for the operation. She stood dead still in the middle of the ballroom as it slowly emptied out with the agonizing crawl of federal bureaucracy. Agents bagging evidence, billionaires sweating through interrogations before being released. The 5-tier fake wedding cake towering over the empty dance floor where absolutely no one had danced. The cobalt blue gown still shimmered under the crystal lights. She began to rock her torso forward, backward. The exact same rhythm. The rhythm that regulated the chaos. The rhythm that had fueled every single agonizing night, writing microscopic code on a yellow pad. Every encrypted data packet fired into the dark web. Every flawless fragment of truth engineered by a mind that didn't know how to take shortcuts because it didn't need them. All it needed was time, data patterns, and a structurally flawed elevator shaft. The equation was perfectly balanced. The armored federal transport van was idling aggressively outside the main entrance of the Imperiale Hotel with the heavy, thudding diesel purr of a vehicle that doesn't apologize for blocking traffic. The press had swarmed. Not the pathetic society bloggers invited to cover the red carpet. Those parasites had shown up with VIP lanyards, hunting for glossy photos of expensive jewelry and empty celebrity quotes. The absolute wolves currently bleeding onto the sidewalk were hard news investigative reporters. The kind that get a terrifying encrypted text from an FBI source at midnight warning them that a monster is being dragged out of a castle in cuffs. TV cameras were hoisted on shoulders. Boom mics were shoved like spears. The blinding, aggressive white glare of the camera floodlights violently washed out the shadows. turning every terrified billionaire face into tomorrow morning's breaking news thumbnail. Clayton Montgomery Vance was frog-marched out the revolving glass doors flanked by tactical vests. His custom grey tuxedo was wrecked, not ripped to shreds in some cinematic brawl, but carrying the pathetic, sweaty wrinkles of a man who just spent an hour marinating in pure terror inside clothes engineered for cocktail hours. His silk tie was violently askew. Under the brutal, unforgiving white glare of the news cameras, his medical-grade spray tan looked grotesque, exposing the sickly, orange desperation of a fake color that never belonged to the sun. He desperately kept his chin tilted slightly upward. It was the absolute last surviving reflex of his shattered ego, the muscle memory of 30 years of PR. Training fighting to keep his spine straight even as his brain screamed that he was a dead man walking. His panicked eyes instinctively hunted the camera lenses, not to project innocence, but because cameras had always been his drug. And his collapsing nervous system hadn't yet realized they were now the executioner's firing squad. The morning headlines would be written by vicious editors who knew exactly how to twist the knife. Asterisk, the king of Wall Street slaughtered by the queen of the basement. Asterisk. His sprawling mansion was raided and federally sealed before midnight, the brutal asset. Forfeiture protocols triggered by a multi-billion-dollar money laundering bust do not politely wait for a judge's gavel. The fleet of imported sports cars was flatbedded to a secure federal impound lot. His super yacht was locked down at the marina by an electronic federal injunction before the sun even came up. His private art collection, a dozen masterpieces, insured for amounts that made. The fake receipts looked like a joke, was systematically ripped off the walls by forensic auditors wearing white cotton gloves. Moving with the terrifying, agonizing patience of feds who know that rushing a raid just gives expensive defense lawyers a loophole. Every single asset liquidated to pay back the blood money owed to the federal government. The final bill was $2.8 billion. Iris had mathematically projected that exact number 18 months ago with a margin of error of less than 3%. She had aggressively audited her own math using 3 different forensic methodologies because absolute, flawless precision was her baseline factory setting, not the ultimate goal. Back inside the Imperiale ballroom, the catering staff was silently clearing the tables. It was the invisible, ghost-like labor that happens at the graveyard end of every billionaire's party, stripping the glossy illusion, violently resetting the room back to the empty concrete box it was before the magic tricks started, ripping the silk tablecloths off, shoving the crystal glasses into plastic racks. The 5-tier fake cake was wheeled away completely intact, destined for a dumpster or a freezer, but definitely not into the mouths of anyone who had survived that room tonight. Iris was still anchored to her exact tactical coordinates. Front row of the dance floor. Direct line of sight to the empty stage, the mic stand gone. The banker gone. The abandoned champagne flute scooped up 40 minutes ago by a busboy who tossed it in the trash with the exact same dead-eyed apathy he applied to the rest of the garbage. She was still gripping her own glass. The champagne was totally dead. It had warmed to the exact ambient temperature of a massive hotel ballroom post-FBI raid, which was vastly warmer than vintage champagne was ever meant to be served. The bubbles had almost entirely flatlined, but a few microscopic gas pockets still clung to the microscopic flaws inside the baccarat crystal, floating upward with the relentless physics of nature that completely ignores human trauma. She had been staring at that exact geometric pattern for a long time. There was something profoundly, mathematically satisfying in how the carbon dioxide organized itself not randomly, but anchoring to specific microscopic imperfections in the glass that acted as nucleation sites. Every single bubble following a predictable vertical trajectory that could be mapped if the algorithm was flawless. She raised the glass. There was absolutely no one left to toast with. She had calculated this outcome as highly probable before she even bought the dress, running the data on the average duration of a massive federal raid. She had estimated an 86% chance that the ballroom would be completely evacuated, leaving her drinking alone. She took a tiny sip. The violent fizz hit her sensory receptors before the taste. Did the microscopic bubbles exploding against her tongue and palate, triggering a massive, simultaneous tactile and gustatory spike that her hypersensitive nervous system immediately flagged as highly abrasive, crashing into the specific red zone of textures that caused her physical pain. The actual flavor profile was sharply acidic with a rorting, sweet undertone that wasn't technically disgusting, but was so violently overpowered by the aggressive texture that she couldn't process the taste. She hated it. But she deeply respected the mathematical symmetry of the crystal glass. She placed the dead champagne back onto a passing tray with the robotic, functional gesture of a scientist completing a harsh experiment, logging the negative result and realizing there was absolutely zero need to repeat the test. The special agent in charge approached her after the last terrified billionaire's statement had been logged, when the massive ballroom had reached that eerie, echoing silence right before the lights get killed. He was wearing an expression she instantly mathematically categorized, a complex blend of deep professional awe, mixed with the specific, loaded question that powerful men ask when they are about to offer you something they genuinely believe you can't refuse. The job offer for a senior forensic accountant position at the FBI was pitched using every aggressive corporate buzzword designed to convey elite prestige, a massive GS 15 salary bump, god-tier federal clearance. The exact kind of institutional power that would totally validate the 18 months of hell she had just survived. She let him finish the entire pitch. Too much noise. Her response was a razor blade, delivered with the terrifying brevity of a woman who never felt the need to apologize for exactly who she was. Too many humans. 1 second pause. I vastly prefer working remote. The special agent stood there, his brain violently buffering as he processed the rejection. Then, he slowly nodded. He dipped his head with the profound, genuine respect of a man who just received an answer he completely failed to anticipate, but instantly recognized was flawlessly consistent with everything he had witnessed this woman do tonight. The empire she built next didn't happen overnight. It was methodically engineered over months, completely routed through encrypted channels that required zero physical human interaction. Massive, unredacted forensic dossiers pumped directly into the Federal Reserve servers with the terrifying, robotic punctuality that quickly became the signature of a ghost. An anonymous shadow whose face nobody knew, but whose catastrophic results were undeniable. The home office was a fortress built inside a rented spare bedroom in a quiet, heavily wooded suburb of Boston. 3 massive, ultra-wide monitors, a hardened, redundant fiber optic mainline, a hyper-ergonomic mesh chair with micro-adjustable lumbar support that she had ruthlessly researched for 14 straight days. Because any hardware requiring prolonged physical contact demanded an auditing process strictly proportional to the sensory risk. The Persian kid showed up 6 months later, a totally unmapped variable. She had stumbled into a weekend adoption drive hosted by a local rescue group, the exact same kind of non-profit network that had blindly shoved her into that bank basement years ago. The massive ball of fur had crawled into her lap while she sat on a folding chair, spending 40 minutes calculating the logistical, financial, and temporal load of animal husbandry. The cat just sat there. The weight was mathematically perfect. The body heat was optimal. The low, vibrating frequency of its purr instantly synced with her nervous system, aggressively down-regulating her anxiety. Before she had even finished running the math on buying cat litter, she immediately filled out the intake paperwork. Her heavy-duty, noise-cancelling headphones sat permanently next to her mechanical keyboard. Her uniform was now a pure cotton pajama set, aggressively washed over 50 times until the fabric broke down into the exact, hyper-specific softness required to survive an 18-hour coding binge. The glowing screens flashed with financial algorithms so wildly complex they looked like alien hieroglyphics. To anyone lacking the cipher, but to her, they were just basic patterns, and patterns have rules. And rules can be broken. She was currently the highest paid, most lethal forensic financial consultant in the United States. Absolutely no one on Wall Street knew her real name. They only knew the body count, the billions of dollars violently ripped back into the federal treasury. The massive corporate frauds she flagged 6 months before the government's billion-dollar AI models even smelled smoke. The catastrophic reports slamming onto the desks of the SEC. Signed with nothing but a single initial that terrified billionaires had learned to recognize as a death warrant. The dress was framed. It hung inside a massive, custom-built glass display case on the wall of her home office, not because the raw silk needed atmospheric protection, but because there was something flawlessly, mathematically correct about preserving the exact object that had served as her armor, her weapon, and the absolute proof that her equation was right. The cobalt blue sapphire threads still shimmered under a highly specific, directional LED spotlight she had personally wired and angled to perfectly mimic the light refraction of a baccarat crystal chandelier. Right next to the glass case hung a small, raw wood plaque. The letters were laser-etched. No frills, no gaudy borders. The phrase had been selected for its absolute, brutal precision. Not for poetry, it was the most terrifyingly accurate summary of everything she had learned during 18 months of writing tiny numbers on a yellow pad, firing encrypted emails into the void, and ruining a Strauss waltz. Asterisk numbers do not possess prejudice. They simply exist. Asterisk, to truly understand the catastrophic fallout on the other side of the glass, we need to jump forward a few years in the timeline. The industrial laundry room of the minimum security federal prison reeked of that highly specific, suffocating stench where boiling water, cheap detergent, and thousands of pounds of damp, filthy fabric violently collide, an odor that becomes invisible if you rot there long enough, but hits you like a physical punch to the throat the first time you walk in. The massive commercial washing machines roared with a deafening, mechanical drone that aggressively drowned the room in the brutal democracy of noise that doesn't give a damn who is listening. Clayton Montgomery Vance was folding prison uniforms. It wasn't a task that required an MBA, there was a rigid physical technique, a rhythm, a precise sequence of folds that resulted in a perfectly standardized rectangle that fit on the metal supply shelf. It was grueling, repetitive, mindless labor, the exact, catastrophic polar opposite of the godlike myth he had built for himself over 30 years on Wall Street. The cheap CRT television bolted to the wall in the common area was blasting at maximum volume just to bleed over the roaring machines. It was the early afternoon financial news block, the kind of ambient garbage broadcast. In prison waiting rooms, on the off chance someone is listening, but with the cynical assumption that nobody actually is. The anchor's voice dropped into that serious, hushed register reserved for massive institutional shifts, delivering the news with the gravity of a bomb threat. The ghost-like genius behind the largest single asset recovery operation in US history, a shadow consultant known to the feds only as Artemis, who single-handedly vaporized the Orion bank cartel. The photograph flashed onto the screen. The cobalt blue gown, dripping in sapphire threads, was aggressively unmistakable. It had blinded him under the baccarat chandeliers on the night his entire life was violently murdered. And it shimmered exactly the same way in the photo, caught under a different light. The woman's face was aggressively blurred out by federal censors. A brutal, very real security measure, because Artemis was actively hunting bigger cartels, and a weapon that lethal requires heavy, anonymous armor. The face was a blur, the dress was not. The stack of freshly folded prison uniforms hit the wet concrete floor with the dull, pathetic slap of cheap fabric that lacks the mass to make a real noise, but communicates exactly how completely a man's soul just shattered. Clayton stood completely paralyzed, his empty, trembling hands hovering in the air where the clothes used to be. There is a terrifying biological process when the brain is forced to connect the dots of its own destruction. The dress, the news anchor, the ghost name Artemis, the violent realization chaining that photo to that ballroom, to that plastic thumb drive, to the back of that armored FBI van. It didn't hit him as a shocking plot twist. It hit him as the agonizing confirmation of a nightmare his subconscious had already figured out years ago, but his massive ego had violently refused to accept. The first tears were violently pushed out by a blinding rage that had absolutely nothing left to attack. There was no $5-100-$and-hour defense lawyer to scream at, no slick PR team to spin the narrative, no gold-plated microphone to amplify his lies. There was only the damp concrete, the roaring washing machines, the dirty laundry on the floor, and the cheap television broadcasting his pathetic ruin to a room full of ghosts. In your absolute honest opinion, what was the most catastrophic punishment for the banker, rotting in a federal cell and losing his billions? Or the ego-shattering realization that he was utterly destroyed by the exact same neurodivergent mind he had sadistically mocked in front of 500 elites? Drop your brutal truth in the comments. I need to know what you think. Back in the Boston Home Office later that exact same afternoon, the massive Persian cat shifted its weight slightly in Iris's lap without waking up the tiny, microscopic physical adjustment cats make when dropping into deep REM sleep. Iris had learned to absorb the shift without flinching because any sudden, jerky movement would violently disrupt the cat's regulatory process. The ultra-wide monitors were flashing a brand new sequence of anomalies. There was a microscopic, terrifying glitch buried deep inside a massive energy sector pension fund. It had tripped her algorithm 3 times over the last month. It was way too tiny to set off the SEC's bloated automated alarms, but it was occurring with a statistical frequency that completely obliterated any margin of random variance. She clicked open a blank digital notepad. She typed out the very first column of numbers. This story proves that the brilliant mind the world arrogantly shoves into the basement is usually the absolute only one watching the house burn down, and the neurological difference toxic bullies treat as a disease is the exact lethal superpower that no billion-dollar fraud can ever hide from, because it was built by arrogant men who could never comprehend a mind that didn't think like theirs. If you crave stories where raw, weaponized intelligence absolutely annihilates arrogant power, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell to join our family. She took their exclusion and forged it into a sniper rifle. And the numbers, as always, executed the target perfectly.